When we think about democracy, the vast majority of the West has a positive view of democratic ideas. Now, while we differ in how to structure those ideas, the core philosophy is that democracy, or governing through the will of the people rather than a single person or a small group, is typically the best governing system. However, this was not always the case. Democracy as we see it today is a relatively new concept, and it hasn't always lived up to its promises. So, what do philosophers have to say about democracy? Well, many prominent philosophers, like Plato, Hegel, and even Nietzsche, were heavily against the core arguments for democratic ideas. Now, before we dismiss this as elitism or ancient history, we do need to sit with something difficult. What if there is a genuine tension between freedom and competence that we simply haven't solved? According to them, by the people is a flawed system. And if that's the case, then how do we progress in society? Well, today we are going to explore those very ideas. So let's start in Athens in 399 BCE. The city that invented democracy just executed the wisest man in Greece. Socrates, at 70 years old, was put on trial and convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth by a jury of 500 ordinary Athenian citizens, citizens of supposedly the most advanced democracy the world had ever seen. According to accounts from his followers, Socrates openly espoused anti-democratic views, arguing that correct policy comes not from the majority opinion, but from genuine knowledge and professional competence possessed by only a few. He questioned politicians publicly and made the powerful look very foolish. Worse, even some of his former students had been among the 30 tyrants. And after Athens had just lived through hell, losing the Peloponnesian War to Sparta, enduring a brutal oligarchy called the 30 Tyrants, who killed about 5% of the population, and democracy only having been restored 4 years before the trial, the city was essentially traumatized, paranoid, and desperate for stability. And Socrates had made himself the problem. So when the restored democracy looked at Socrates, they saw a very big threat. He represented the idea that most people are not qualified to make the decisions that shape their lives. And Athens, desperate to believe in itself again, could not tolerate those ideas. And this execution broke something in Plato, Socrates' student. He watched the wisest man he knew die because a crowd voted for it. And from that trauma came one of the most systematic critiques of democracy ever written. In The Republic, Plato criticized democracy and even built an entire alternative. He imagines a city called Callipolis, where society is divided into 3 classes: producers who make things, auxiliaries who protect the city, and philosopher kings who rule. Plato argued that only philosophers, through their knowledge of the forms and particularly the form of good, are morally and intellectually suited to rule. And this is a very interesting proposal. He's arguing for a permanent class of rulers that are selected in childhood, educated for decades in things like math, philosophy, and ethics, and are forbidden from owning property or having families of their own. These philosopher kings would govern based on what is objectively good. Now, Plato's most devastating critique comes in the form of a simple analogy. Imagine a ship whose owner is strong, but deaf and nearly blind, with poor knowledge of navigation, while the sailors argue over who should control the helm despite none having studied navigation. The sailors don't even believe that navigation is a real skill. They just fight for power. And Plato says that this is democracy, that we are on a ship in a storm, and we're taking votes on which direction to sail. But the person who wins is not always the one who knows where we should be going. And in the modern era, it's often the one who is most convincing, charismatic, and best at telling people what they want to hear. Meanwhile, the actual navigator, who has studied the stars and understands the currents, sits in the corner ignored. And Plato had some very well thought out arguments based on his personal experience. A man he heavily admired was put to death by a democratic crowd. And it's not as if we don't see this in the modern era. I mean, just think about the South less than a century ago. If a white person accused a black person of wrongdoing, all it took was a botched jury to sentence them to life in prison or even death. But the opposite can also be true. If someone commits a crime, but has a lawyer who is good enough to convince the jury of their innocence, then the criminal is set free. And according to Plato and other philosophers that we'll discuss in just a second, this is the core problem with democratic ideas. Those who hold the vote are rarely equipped to know who or what they can vote for. Now, you can argue that if we were to dispose of the jury system and leave the decision up to the philosopher judge, then perhaps that would solve some of our democratic problems. We get to keep our rights and our freedoms, but we just need to change a few things. But, according to Hegel, even this is wrong. So, let's jump forward a few thousand years to Germany in 1810. The context is completely different, but the critique remains the same. Napoleon had essentially steamrolled through the German states, defeating them with humiliating ease. The French, with their revolution and their modern army and their ideological fever, had shown the Germans that they were behind in every way possible. Militarily, intellectually, politically, and even culturally. This crisis demanded a response, and Hegel provided one. His philosophy of right is a complete re-imaging of what the state is and what individuals are within it. Where the French and Americans were building democracies based on individual rights and popular sovereignty, Hegel said they had it completely backwards. Hegel argued that individuals do not have rights that exist prior to the state, or you don't join a state to protect pre-existing freedoms. Instead, as he writes, it is by becoming a citizen of a good state that the individual first comes into his right. Rights are created by the state, not protected by it. You are nothing outside of the political order. The state is not your servant, you are its instrument. And this is in stark contrast with the American philosophy of freedoms and rights. Philosophers that influenced our Constitution and Bill of Rights believed that rights and freedoms are imbued by God, and that the state exists to protect those. But for Hegel, God has nothing to do with your rights or your freedoms. And this is why he rejected these social contract theories that were popular in Britain and America. The whole idea of individuals negotiating with each other to form a government misunderstands what individuals are. As Hegel put it, you become you through becoming aware of others who are at the same time becoming aware of you. In other words, your individuality is socially constructed. Think of it in terms of a machine. According to core American ideals, you yourself are the machine that keeps the state running. But according to Hegel, you are simply a gear in the machine, and the machine is the state. And just as your skin cells don't have rights against your body, you do not have rights against the state. And Hegel was explicit about this. He writes, "A single person, I need hardly say, is something subordinate, and as such, he must dedicate himself to the ethical whole. Hence, if the state claims life, the individual must surrender it." And he goes on to write about his contempt for the masses. He says, "The truth is that if people means a particular section of citizens, then it means precisely that section which does not know what it wills." So let's break this down, because hearing it the first time is a little confusing. He is saying that most people are ignorant about policy, economics, and what's happening in the world. They are governed by passions and immediate interests. So why would we let them make decisions? And even worse is the idea of equality that democracies promote. He writes, "The demand sometimes made for an equal division of land and other available resources too is an intellectualism all the more empty and superficial." His argument is that nature creates inequality. People are born with different talents, energy, and even have different luck in life. And any attempt to impose equality is fighting reality. And if you were to hypothetically redistribute everything equally today, inequality would return tomorrow. What Hegel proposed instead was a state where power flows from the top down, where expert administrators and a professional bureaucracy make decisions, or where the economy is managed and directed rather than left to individual choice. Religion and state would be integrated, not separated. Education would be state-controlled to form citizens properly. And this is something closer to what we'd call authoritarianism, justified by an elaborate philosophical system claiming to represent the march of history itself. So, okay, according to these philosophers, here's what we've lost so far: the right to a jury, the right to question or even choose our government, the right to choose our own religion, and the right to choose how we educate our children, and even the right to make any real decisions that could negatively impact our government. I mean, geez, what else is there to lose? And is anybody explaining why this is a good thing? Like, I get that a lot of people might not be capable of making rational decisions in government, but is it really a reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Well, let's talk about our good old friend Nietzsche for a minute. Oh, sorry, wrong picture. Nietzsche, yes. Writing in the late 1800s as democracy was spreading across Europe, Nietzsche looked at this development with horror. Not because he loved autocracy or he wanted kings, but because he saw democracy producing something far worse than tyranny or freedom. Instead, he saw it producing mediocrity as a permanent condition of humanity. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduced the concept of the last man. The last man is the archetypal passive nihilist, tired of life, taking no risks, seeking only comfort and security, and unable to build and act upon a self-actualized ethos. According to Nietzsche, this is what democracy creates: a society of people who have given up on greatness, who want only safety and pleasure and the absence of pain. Because that's definitely not what our society looks like today. But here's what makes Nietzsche's critique so cutting. When Zarathustra warns a crowd about the coming of the last man, expecting them to be repelled by this vision of mediocrity, they instead beg him, "Give us this last man, O Zarathustra. Make us into these last men." They hear the description of a comfortable, safe, equal society where everyone is the same and no one suffers. And they think that it sounds perfect. Nietzsche saw democracy as the political expression of what he called herd mentality. The herd wants everyone to be equal, comfortable, and safe. And he associated democracy with Christianity and saw both as promoting a slave morality that emphasizes humility, self-denial, and the suppression of individual desires, in contrast to a master morality that celebrates strength, creativity, and self-affirmation. The state, Nietzsche argued, facilitates this leveling. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he called the state the coldest of all cold monsters, and wrote that it lies when it says, I, the state, am the people. The state does not exist to represent the people. Instead, it entraps them in comfort and offers them security in exchange for their ambition, creativity, and their will to become something greater. What terrified Nietzsche was not that democracy would fail, but that it would succeed, and that we would create exactly the kind of society we say we want: peaceful, equal, comfortable, and safe. And in doing so, we would breed a humanity incapable of achieving anything great. Nietzsche warned that the society of the last man could be too barren and decadent to support the growth of healthy human life or great individuals. And it seems that we are getting closer and closer to this idea of democracy. The longer we go on, the more comfort that people demand. You start out with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you end up with the right to free healthcare, free education, and the demand for equality of outcome, not of opportunity. Every day, Western democracies are trading time and money for comfort and security. We have traded the majority of our income for bigger houses, new gadgets, more vacations, and easier lifestyles. Some of us are willing to spend twice as much money on food just so we don't have to cook. So Nietzsche wasn't wrong when he warned that democracy has the potential to lead to a society of sheep. So we have three philosophers, separated by centuries, working in radically different contexts, and all coming to the same conclusion: that most people do not know what they're doing. Political decisions require knowledge, wisdom, long-term thinking, and the ability to see beyond immediate interests. Democracy depends on chance, Plato argued, and without able and virtuous leaders who come and go by accident, it is not a good form of government. If ruling a state is a craft, then it needs experts who are carefully selected and extensively trained. And they're not entirely wrong, are they? Because think about the average voter. How much do they really know about monetary policy or foreign affairs or the complexities of the healthcare system? Most people are busy living their lives. They're raising kids and dealing with their own problems. They don't have time to become experts in everything that the government touches. And when we look at actual democracies, what do we see? Politicians who win by telling people what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Policies that are driven by emotion rather than evidence. And short-term thinking, because elections happen every few years. So if they're right that most people are not qualified to make complex political decisions, what is the alternative? Plato's philosopher kings who rule because they know the truth, Hegel's state that represents the march of God in history, where individuals exist only to serve the collective, or Nietzsche's vision of a society organized to produce great individuals rather than happiness for all. Every attempt to implement rule by experts, rule by the wise, or rule by those who know better has ended pretty badly because concentrating power in the hands of a few, even if they are brilliant and well intentioned, creates its own problems that are worse than the problems democracy has. But the ideas these philosophers expressed were challenged. Not everyone believes that democracy leads to incompetence and mediocrity. In the next video, we'll take on the other side, the philosophers who defended democracy at every step and believed wholeheartedly that the will of the people is what keeps society held together. So, be sure to stick around as we explore that later this week. And with that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.